The old man handed me an envelope and said, "You need to know what your family did before you forget who you are." I laughed because I thought he was confused. Then I saw the photograph inside. It showed me at 7 years old, standing beside my mother in a park I hadn't seen since childhood. But behind us was the same old man, decades younger, watching from a distance. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about that park because I barely remembered it myself. I looked at him and asked, "Who are you?" He only said, "Someone your father trusted." Then he walked away before I could stop him. I spent that night staring at the photograph, trying to remember the day it was taken. The next morning, I called my older brother, Daniel. His voice changed the second I mentioned the picture. He told me to throw it away. That scared me more than the photograph. Yet, if stories like this keep you wondering what really happens behind closed family doors, subscribe to Family Betrayal and stay with me, because what I discovered next changed the way I saw my entire childhood. And just so you know, the photos, faces, backgrounds, and scenes shown in this video are visual recreations meant only to help imagine the story. Daniel insisted our father had never known the old man. But when I asked why he sounded frightened, he hung up. I drove to my mother's house and searched through an old box she had kept in the closet. At the bottom, beneath birthday cards and faded letters, I found a second photograph. It was the same park. This time, my father was there too. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 6 words: "He promised he would protect you." I couldn't breathe. Protect me from what? And why had my family spent 30 years hiding this man from me? Then my phone rang. It was the old man. His first sentence made my hands go cold. "Your father wasn't the man you think he was." I drove back to the park before sunrise, hoping the old man would be there. He was sitting on the same bench, holding a small metal key. He told me his name was Arthur and that my father had asked him to keep something safe in case our family ever turned against me. I wanted to believe him, but part of me thought I was being manipulated. Arthur took me to a storage room behind an old community center. The key opened a rusted cabinet. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with blue string, all written by my father. The first one began with my name. He wrote that when I was 7, he discovered someone had been stealing money from our family business. He suspected Daniel, but he never confronted him because Daniel had threatened to ruin our family if anyone exposed him. I read the letters with shaking hands. My father wrote that he feared something worse than losing money. He feared Daniel wanted control of everything, including the house and the inheritance. Arthur had helped my father move important documents into hiding. Then my father wrote something that made me stop reading. He said the truth would only be revealed when I was old enough to protect myself. I called Daniel immediately. He answered after 3 rings. I asked him about the business money. There was silence. Then he said, "You should have left the past alone." My anger exploded. I took everything to an attorney who specialized in estate disputes. Daniel refused to explain anything. Now Daniel showed up at my house. He brought a lawyer and a folder containing papers I had never seen. They claimed my father had left nearly everything to Daniel. I asked why they were showing me those papers now. Daniel smiled and said, "Because you're about to make a mistake." And then I noticed the date on the documents. They had been signed 2 days after my father died. Have you ever trusted someone simply because they were family, even when something inside you told you not to? I kept thinking about that question as Daniel placed the papers in front of me. I still didn't know the worst part. Arthur had one final letter my father had never shown me. Arthur called me that night and told me to meet him alone. When I arrived, he looked exhausted. He handed me the final letter and said, "Your father made me promise I would wait until Daniel tried to take your inheritance." The letter explained everything. My father had discovered that Daniel had forged documents years earlier to make it appear that he owned part of the family property. My father quietly changed his estate plan and placed the real documents with Arthur. He didn't trust banks, lawyers, or even relatives who could be pressured. But there was another secret. My father had learned that I was not supposed to know any of this as a child because Daniel had been watching me. He had tried to convince our mother that I was irresponsible and couldn't handle money. My father worried Daniel would use me as a way to gain control. I felt sick reading it. Memories suddenly made sense. The strange arguments. The locked desk. My mother crying in the kitchen. Daniel always telling me that Dad didn't trust me. For years, I believed those things were true. Then Arthur gave me a notebook. Inside were records of every payment Daniel had taken from the business. The amounts were far larger than I imagined. I took everything to an attorney who specialized in estate disputes. Daniel's confidence disappeared. He called me repeatedly, first angry, then apologetic, then desperate. Finally, he came to my house alone. He admitted he had taken money, but he claimed he did it because he thought our father loved me more. That sentence broke something inside me. After all those years, his excuse wasn't greed. It was jealousy. I asked him one question. Was ruining our family worth it? He looked at the floor and said nothing. The attorney called me the next morning and said there was one more document in my father's file, and it had nothing to do with money. The final document was a handwritten note from my father, dated 3 weeks before he died. It wasn't about property, business, or Daniel. It was about me. He wrote that he had watched me become kind despite everything around me, and that his greatest fear was that the family conflict would turn my heart bitter. He had left me the property, but only because he wanted me to have a place where nobody could ever make me feel unwanted again. He wrote that if Daniel ever admitted the truth, I should decide for myself whether forgiveness was possible. I sat alone in my car and cried. I had spent weeks imagining the perfect revenge, yet my father had given me something harder, the choice to let go. The legal process ended with the false documents rejected and the stolen money accounted for. There was no joy. Months later, I returned to the park. Arthur was sitting on the bench. I thanked him for keeping his promise. He smiled and said, "Your father knew you would eventually find your way back to the truth." I asked why he had waited so long. Arthur looked at the photograph and said, "Because your father believed you needed to discover the truth yourself, not inherit someone else's version of it." I kept the childhood photograph, not because it proved what happened, but because it reminded me that sometimes the truth survives even when people spend years trying to bury it. I learned that family doesn't give anyone the right to control your life, and forgiveness doesn't mean pretending betrayal never happened. Sometimes peace comes from knowing the truth and refusing to let it poison the rest of your life. If you were in my place, would you have forgiven Daniel or walked away forever? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to Family Betrayal for more stories where the truth comes out when nobody expects it. The people who hurt us may write the darkest chapter, but they don't get to write the ending.